one second. Let me try to connect and disconnect.
Welcome to this episode of Intellectual Catholicism. Today I'm here with Dr. Khalil Andani. Apologies for the technical issues that we've been having. There's just some kind of glitching going on. And so Dr. Khalil might have to go and leave real quick to set things up. Is that correct? Or do you think we can manage with what we have now?
If it's not good, you let me know and I'll reset my connection. So.
Okay, and I'll be paying attention to the chat to just see if they are complaining at all. I mean, it seems to have cleared up just a little bit, so we'll see. Also, I'm so sorry because as the countdown was going down, I heard you say, "Oh, I might need to leave," and I was like, well, the countdown's going and we're live, so sorry about that. No, I hope that it wasn't personal or anything. It was just a mistake. Well, Dr. Khalil, maybe we can kind of test out the quality on your end by just seeing if we can have you introduce yourself.
Sure, yes. So if you can hear me, what I was saying is that if it's too glitchy, I can just reset my internet, So you can let me know if it's not smooth. Mm-hmm. It's nice to be here. I've known about this show for some time when it was under the old name, right? I think it was Intellectual Conservatism. So it's nice to be here. Who am I? Well, my name is Khalil Andani. I'm an assistant professor of religion. Sorry, give me 1 second. There's a repair guy here. Yeah, so I'm an assistant professor of religion at Augustana College, where I teach courses on Islam, Christian-Muslim relations, the study of religion. And I have a PhD and 2 master's degrees in Islamic studies from Harvard University. I specialize in the intellectual history of Islam, which basically involves studying the primary sources of multiple traditions within Islam, such as Islamic theology or Kalam, Islamic philosophy, Shia Islam, Islamic mysticism known as Sufism. And lately, in the past year or two, I have also published material in what is known as the contemporary philosophy of religion, which is a field that not many Muslims participate in. So that's sort of like a new thing. But there's a new movement now toward globalizing the philosophy of religion. We're inviting voices from religion. So on one hand, I do academic work from a historian's perspective, right? Most of my published work is like that, right? Where you're just doing history and you're documenting how ideas evolve without judging what is true or what is false. But in some of my recent work in the philosophy of religion, I have done some more constructive type work, where you do take a certain metaphysical position and you argue for one position over another. So I'm sort of doing a little bit of both what you would call descriptive work in the study of religion and constructive work. And it's important to keep in mind that these are 2 different kinds of methodologies, right, in academia. And some people only one or the other, and some people like myself do a bit of both.
Yeah, Khalil, I really appreciate all the work that you've been doing online. And I know that we kind of have a bit of limited time, but if I can shower praises on you before we go forward, your YouTube channel is truly incredible. The lectures that you produce, they're all high quality. It's so much fun to watch them. I was binging a little bit to prepare for this interview, and I just really enjoy the perspective that you're bringing to the table. In some of your presentations, you mentioned how the philosophy of religion is really dominated by Christian theology and Christian notions of God and questions. And you're bringing in the Islamic perspective, which I think is going to not just make the field better by getting voices in from different cultures and backgrounds. And, even though, I'm Catholic and you're Muslim, we're both brothers in the classical theist tradition. And so I really appreciate having your voice on this. Well, Khalil.
Well, that's very kind of you to It's very kind of to say that. I personally think a lot of my YouTube channel stuff is rather boring. There was a time when PowerPoint slides on YouTube was cutting edge, like 10 years ago, when my channel started. But I think the quality is much higher now. And when I get some time, when I'm not grading, or helping take care of kids, I do wish to sort of up my YouTube game and get some video production and editing, but it's hard to do right now. But I thank you for that. And I will say this, that in the philosophy of religion, the type of work that many Muslims from my background find most useful is the work done by Catholic philosophers, right?
Wow.
Other classical theists. So we find, and I speak for many people, right, the work of people like Edward Feser, for example, or Brian Davies, or Dave. I know he's not a Catholic, but they're the closest thing in the philosophy of religion that we find that is in dialogue with what we have in the Islamic philosophical mystical tradition is large coming from Catholic and some Orthodox philosophers and theologians, and for the most part, not from some of these sort of like analytic Protestants who tend to come up with proposals that us and find disagreeable. So it is interesting that people used to think that people are prone to viewing interfaith dialogue in an adversarial sense along religious lines, right? So it's like Muslim versus Christian. But as I teach in all my students, this is a very oversimplified thing. Rather, if we dig deep, we'll find that Christians themselves are divided on certain theological issues, and Muslims are divided on certain theological issues. So what you're seeing now, and if you look at what's going on in YouTube, there are alliances happening, but it's not Christian versus Muslim, right? It's this type of Muslim and this type of Christian are on the same side of an issue, and then certain Protestants maybe, certain Orthodox maybe, and other kinds of Muslims are on another side of the issue. Such as divine simplicity, is it true or false? Divine simplicity is not a Christian versus a Muslim issue. It's a Christian and Muslim, a Christian and another Muslim issue.
Yeah. Well, Khalil, let's get going then into the question of Neoplatonism itself. Just kind of introduce us to what this idea is, and I think this will help kind of set the groundwork for the rest of your presentation here.
So it glitched a bit. You're asking me about Neoplatonism?
Yeah, just could you introduce the idea to us so that we can get the groundwork?
The Islam part or just Neoplatonism?
Just Neoplatonism on a broad kind of introductory level.
Sure. So Neoplatonism, the word, is a modern invention. Okay, let's be very clear about that. If you go back 1,000 years ago, 500 years ago, nobody uses this word. So this is just a modern term. Okay, but what the modern Neoplatonism describes is a family of intellectual traditions. Okay, a family of traditions. So multiple traditions, not just one school, but multiple schools of thought that all share certain things in common their worldviews, right? So the family of intellectual traditions that are labeled Neoplatonism, they all, for example, believe that the ultimate cause or the ultimate foundation, the ultimate ground of all reality is an absolutely simple, absolutely transcendent principle. Some people call it the one, some people call it God, some people call it the Godhead, right? There are different terms for this supreme principle, but there's agreement that it is absolutely simple and absolutely transcendent, right? Then the second trait of Neoplatonic traditions is the idea that physical reality, right, is not self-standing, and physical reality is actually not the direct product of God or the One. Rather, there is a hierarchy of intermediary realities that mediate between the absolutely simple God or One and the spatio-temporal physical world. Now, different Neoplatonic traditions conceive or model intermediary reality differently, but there is agreement that the intermediary realities are incorporeal and they transcend space and time as we know it. So these are intermediary spiritual realities. But then there's diversity on how many intermediaries there are and what kind of intermediaries we're talking about, right? The simplest Neoplatonism has one universal intellect and one universal soul. As more complex Neoplatonic models may have 10 intellects and 10 souls, and it can get very big. Some schools have like an infinite number of spiritual intermediaries. But the point is, you have intermediaries, and all of reality is hierarchical. So the supreme principle, the One, or what we call God, right? It's absolutely simple, but it's also infinitely intense in existence, right? And when you go lower, again, hierarchically lower, or not temporally or spatially lower, but as you go lower from the supreme principle, from the One, the intensity of existence gets dimmer, right? So reality or being has different intensity levels in Neoplatonism, right? So that's something to keep in mind as well. And then, there are other ideas in Neoplatonism. So, for example, there's a notion that within the human being, right, you have a microcosm of like all of reality. So the human being has a body, but the human being also has a soul. The human being has an intellect, and there's also a spark within the human being, within the human intellect and soul. There's a spark. There's like a glimmer, or there's a trace of the One, of God, in essence. So in a sense, the whole hierarchy is recapitulated in the human form, and the human being is layered, right? And finally, like I said, the fourth idea is that of soteriology. So, like, what's the end purpose of like human existence, right? And again, it's looked at differently among traditions, but there is a general idea that human beings have to undergo a process of reversion or reintegration. So, in some sense, human beings have to come through a Gnostic, mystical, spiritual sense. Human beings will come to be integrated with the One, or God. Again, different accounts on how that's done. But there is a telos, or purpose, to human existence in these Neoplatonic traditions. So I would say, for starters, it's those four things, and I'll recapitulate. Number one, an absolutely simple ground or foundation of all reality called God, or the One, right? Number two, there are intermediary reality between the One and physical cosmos, right? Number three, the human being, in some sense, is a microcosm of all the different levels of reality, right? And number four, the purpose of human existence is to be reintegrated, right, into these higher orders of reality. And existence at every level, as you go up, existence becomes more intense, to the point where at the level of God, or the One, many Neoplatonists say that the One is beyond existence. To stress the point that whatever we take to be existence, physically or spiritually, the One infinitely exceeds that, right? So sometimes it's better to talk about God or the One as beyond being. That doesn't mean that we're atheists, right? Which some people misinterpret this as atheism. Oh, you say that God does not exist. No, but that negation is a negation exceeding the order of existence, and thereby grounding the order of existence, not nothing. So that point as well.
Yeah, I just want to say that, for me as a classical theist from the Catholic tradition, a lot of what you're saying is just like, it sings to my ears, right? It's like, it's very consonant with the tradition that I'm familiar with. And so, if the connection were better, I think we could have more of a dialogue. But I think right now what I want to do is just give you the platform to really get your ideas across and express, what's going on. And then hopefully we can get better connection in the future one day for another dialogue on this. But, to kind of maybe also get the background still, what's the historical relationship between Islam and Neoplatonism? In one of your presentations, I remember you said that there's the version of Avicenna. There's, I think, Sunni versions of Islamic Neoplatonism. So there's a lot of different ways that one could be an Islamic Neoplatonist. And so could you describe this relationship, and even particularly your Ismaili tradition? And let me know if you got everything across there.
Sure. No, if you want to put up my slides, and I can talk a little bit. I can talk a little bit about this. So, okay, there we go. Right. Let's zoom out a little bit, right? Because Islam is a big tent, right? There's a lot of internal and historical diversity in Islam. So if you look at the intellectual traditions within Islam, like a cross-section perspective, these are some of the major traditions that you can hear on the slide. So what I would stress is that not all Muslims are Neoplatonists, right? It's important to note that, but a good number of Muslims are Neoplatonists. So on the left side of my screen, we have an intellectual tradition in Islam called Kalam, often translated as theology. I don't really like that translation, but for lack of a better word, we just have it there. Kalam is primarily a Sunni Muslim project, although some Shias engage in it. And Kalam is really a methodology of sort of how to know about God, right? And there were 4 major Kalam schools in Muslim history. I've just named them over here, and I'm not going to go through all the details, but originally their worldview on atomism. Okay, they were atomists. Now I don't think they're atomists even today, but you'll find different views. But the point is, in the Kalam tradition, the debates are over. They actually debate whether God is absolutely simple or not. So 3 of the Kalam schools, Hanbali, Ashari, and Maturidi, these 3 schools, they deny divine simplicity. Okay, they think that God has real distinct attributes that are distinct from God's essence. And nevertheless, though, all these attributes are eternal and uncreated, and you can't separate them. Like you can't find the one divine attribute by itself. So in Kalam, 3 schools, some under Hanbali a Kalam school or not, that's a whole other issue. But 3 of the Kalam schools, or Sunni creeds, they deny divine simplicity, and 1 Kalam school known as Mu'tazili, they believe in divine simplicity. All right, and those are the sort of issues that the Kalam people debated. They also is the Quran uncreated or created, and what does that even mean? Like, what is the nature of God's speech? So there are some debates that are really internal to this Kalam tradition. Now, if we move over on the other side, we'll find Islamic mysticism known as Sufism, and then we'll find the philosophical tradition of Islam, which called itself Hikmah, which means wisdom. And again, under here, you find the different schools of thought. Now, what's interesting is that the whole sort of the mystical and the philosophical forms of Islam, broadly speaking, these are all Neoplatonic, right? So Islamic Neoplatonism is basically represented on the right side of my screen. And there are more than 3 Islamic Neoplatonic traditions. I just can't name them all. What they have in common, they have differences, mind you, but what they have in common is what I said at the beginning. So God is absolutely simple. So all Islamic Neoplatonists believe in divine simplicity, but they might disagree. They might disagree about how to articulate divine simplicity, but they all believe in it, right? They all believe in intermediary realities, incorporeal, eternal intermediaries between God and physical reality, right? They all believe that the human self and the human soul, the human intellect, they all believe that these are incorporeal and everlasting. Interestingly, the Kalam tradition initially thought the human soul was made of atoms. Now, most of these people have changed their mind, but the Kalam tradition they initially believed that everything other than God is okay? Whereas the Neoplatonic tradition says we have things that are not God, that are created, but they can still be eternal and or incorporeal. So many of the Islamic Neoplatonists thought that the cosmos is eternal in the sense that some physical reality has always existed, because that was not an issue, like, in Neoplatonism. So have some shared beliefs on the Neoplatonic side. Now, if I were to sort of name drop, because a lot of people look at this and they're like, well, we've never heard, like, who are these Muslim Neoplatonists? And like, now let me be clear. They don't call themselves Neoplatonists. This is just a modern term, but I'm just using a modern term to like cast an umbrella here, right? So the Sufis don't call themselves Neoplatonists. They have their own native term, right? The Ismailis and the Falasifa, they have their own native terms. But again, from an intellectual history point of view, we can say that all of these people you see on my slide here, they are all Neoplatonists. And they're Neoplatonists because this worldview, right? They all believe in this worldview. They believe that Allah, God, is an absolutely simple unity. They believe Allah eternally creates the first intermediary, which is called the first intellect. It's also called the light of Muhammad. So this is actually a form of Islamic logos theology that we have, right? So the essence of Muhammad is understood to be the first eternal creation of God, as well as the intermediary by whom all things are made. Sounds sort of familiar, right? It has some things in common with Christian logos understandings. Not everything, but some things. And then you have a spiritual world and a physical world. And again, there are differences on what the spiritual world looks like. There are even some differences on what the physical world looks like. But this view on the right, this is what all the Muslim Neoplatonists share in common. Whether Sunni, whether they're Shia, or Ismaili, which is my tradition, whether they are from South Asia or Persia, right? There is a widespread Neoplatonic worldview. And you'll notice, like, there are some Neoplatonists in Islam who legally are very conservative. Like some of these people are Hanbalis, like by legal school, very conservative, but they still held this worldview. So that's what I would stress, that in fact, one could argue that if not a majority, a plurality of Muslims over history have held a Neoplatonic worldview. And today, this knowledge has been forgotten. Today, right? There is some day that make it seem that, Neoplatonism was a fringy thing and nobody believed in it. But historically, like as a historian and having the benefit of reading these sources, historically, Islamic Neoplatonism is a very widespread, very popular phenomenon. And there are many popular practices in the Muslim world. Even the simple act of going to a shrine where you seek the blessings of a Muslim saint, the whole theology behind that is Neoplatonic. Like only like Neoplatonic worldviews can explain many Muslim intercessory practices, just like, something similar to Neoplatonism would explain, a Catholic or Orthodox, saint veneration, like that. All right. So then, we could go into some of the differences. So, for example, if you're in the Ismaili tradition, that's the tradition that I come from. And in my philosophical writings, I sort of operate within this worldview. So in the Ismaili tradition, the Neoplatonic worldview, I would say, is rather simple. So you have God, absolutely simple, unconditioned reality. You have an eternal creation of God, which is the universal intellect. And we would put what Platonists called the forms, right? And what Thomists call the divine ideas. We put that at the level of the intellect. We don't put the forms or the divine ideas, archetypes, in God, because we think it violates divine simplicity, for example. So you have an eternal, which is an eternal creation. Now, a lot of people don't know, they think this doesn't make sense, but to be created, which I think many Catholics would agree with, something is created if it depends on God to exist. That's what makes something created. So being temporally, like starting to exist at a particular time, for us is not essential to being created. It's dependence that makes something created. So the intellect is a being that has always existed temporally, but it always depends on God. So it is an eternal creation. And then that intellect emanates a secondary effect, which we call the soul, the universal soul. That's also eternal. So it's another eternal creation, but it's mediated. The soul is the effect of the intellect. It's not the direct effect of God. So the soul has some imperfection. Whereas for us, the intellect is perfect. God creates a perfect being, right? A perfect creation. So the soul is the effect of the intellect. The soul has some imperfection, and that imperfection engenders desire, seeking, right? The desire to become perfect, and desire is what motivates the soul to create physical reality. So for us, the direct cause of physical reality, this universe, the laws of nature, for us, the direct cause of that would be the universal soul, not the intellect and not God. But this doesn't remove God from your life, right? God is eternally giving existence to the whole chain. So God is immanent, God is present through the intermediaries. Because these intermediaries, they're not like these absolutely free sort of creatures that can decide to, like go against God. These intermediaries, by their very nature, are in harmony with God, right? So the divine influx of existence flows through the intellect, flows through the soul, and manifests at every level of the cosmos. So everybody
Khalil,
has a relationship to God. Yes.
Yeah, sorry, Khalil. I'm going to try to figure out. Maybe I'll raise my hand if I want to ask a question. Maybe that might be better.
Sure,
Sorry
yeah.
about that. But I just wanted to ask a question here really quick about the universal intellect and the universal soul. So I know that in your previous lectures, you referred to the universal soul as a she to some extent, right? And I know that I mean, obviously we agree that God is not a person in the same way that you and I are persons. We might say he's personal to some extent, but using that kind of analogically carefully. With the universal intellect and soul, would you say that these are persons or kind of personal? To what extent can we predicate kind of personhood of these intermediaries?
So that's a interesting question. I would say it like this. I would say that God in this worldview is supra-personal. I wouldn't even call God personal. I would say God is supra-personal, because there's no duality in God. There's just no distinctions in God at all. I would say the intellect is transpersonal, because all notions of thought, quality, essences, all of this is in the intellect. I would say the universal soul is personal. I could call the universal soul a person, and the universal soul is the archetype that human persons are directly based on. So I've said this in one of my lectures, maybe you've seen it, and I don't say it in a polemical way. I say it in a technical way, that some analytic philosophers, they say God is a person, and they say God is like a great soul. And I say, yeah, that's fine, but you're not talking about God. You're just talking about the universal soul, right? So if you start at like a human person, like a human psychic self, and you just enlarge this human person, take away all the human flaws, a lot of people think, well, now you're at God. I would say, no, you're just at the universal soul. Like, nice try, but you didn't get all the way to the top. And that brings me to this point that there are many arguments for God in contemporary philosophy of religion. And I would not say that many of those arguments actually get you to God. Some of the universal soul, some of them get you to the universal intellect, get you to God as such.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. But Khalil, I want you to keep on going. Sorry to interrupt.
No problem. So this is like the Ismaili Neoplatonic worldview, like what you're viewing this on to sort of be pluralistic. So big picture, just so we looked at like this group here, right? This is the tradition I'm in, the Ismaili tradition, but there's another tradition called Falsafa. Falsafa is mostly associated with Ibn Sina and Al-Farabi, and there's a whole bunch of thinkers in that school. So their worldview is something like this. Okay, they have God, the necessary being, absolutely simple, and they're looser with language. So they'll call God the first cause, for example, whereas other Neoplatonists like Ismailis, they don't like the word cause. But the Falsafa tradition, they believe in God, right, who's absolutely simple. They will say that in a manner like Thomas Aquinas, they'll say that God is identical to his attributes. Okay, the Falsafa tradition will say that. The Ismaili tradition will say God. So you see, these are some of the differences that you get. But in the Falsafa cosmology, you'll notice that it's in a sphere of intellects, not one intellect. There are 10 intellects. And you can't see it on the screen, but they also believe, many of them believe in 10 souls. And then why are there 10? Well, sort of, my thing just phased out. The geocentric cosmology of that era, right, had the Earth, and then you had like, 9 spheres. So you have like a total of 10 spheres. So they correlated the spiritual world, 10 intellects, 10 souls, with the material world. So this is a different Neoplatonic cosmology, but it's still Neoplatonic because you have God, you have the eternal, incorporeal intermediaries, and right. So this is a different sort of another form of Neoplatonism, like within the Islamic tradition. So those are sort of like the big pictures. Now, personally, I don't go with this one because I think it's too tied to physics, right? Like it's too tied to a particular physical view of the world. And personally, I would have trouble arguing why there have to be 10 intellects based on our current knowledge. Like if you ask me why would someone believe in 10 intellects using natural theology, I couldn't give you a reason. The is this simpler one over here, intellect, soul, cosmos, because I can give you arguments. I can say this is why we know there's an intellect, right? This is why we know there is a soul. This is why we know there is an absolutely simple God. And maybe that will take us to a sort of one of the subtopics you wanted to discuss, was how do Neoplatonists argue for God?
Yeah, we can touch on that, but you were talking about the Ismaili tradition, and it kind of glitched a little bit, and I thought it was a really important point that it glitched out on. So you were saying something like, with respect to the divine attributes in the Ismaili tradition, God is beyond attributes,
Oh,
or what were you
sure.
saying there? Mhm.
Yeah, so in the Ismaili Neoplatonism that you see on this slide, the way to talk about God, the preferred way, is to say that God is beyond attributes. Okay, so Ismailis they don't want to say, they don't want to make a positive predication about God. Like God, let's say, for example, God is wise. Okay, that's a positive predication. So we generally understand, like the everyday understanding of X is wise is that this uh, has the attribute or quality of wisdom, and it's on account of possessing wisdom that X is wise. So that's like the everyday understanding of positive predication, right? So when you're talking about God, Ismailis don't want to use everyday predicative net language because it leads to false conclusions, right? Then people will think that God is wise means God has some uncreated wisdom. And God is merciful will mean, for many people, God has this other item called mercy, right? Now, what the Ismailis will do is they'll take for granted the everyday understanding of predication, right? Where predication leads to some sort of plurality in the subject. And the Ismailis will instead say that God is beyond being wise and being foolish or unwise, right? God is beyond being knowing and ignorance. He transcends these categories, because we can say God is wise, but it would also be true that Socrates is wise. And if we keep to the everyday, the general understanding would require us to affirm that God and Socrates have something in common. There's like a univocal element shared between God and Socrates, but that would violate divine simplicity, right? So the Ismailis opt to say that God is beyond knowledge, wisdom, mercy, power. God is beyond these things, but he is the originator of them. So you can reinterpret a positive predication into a what is called a metonymic predication. So I can say God is wise, but what I mean by that as an Ismaili is wisdom comes from God. So God is the source of wisdom, but he's not the bearer of wisdom. I can say God is all knowing, but what I mean is that knowledge comes from God. God is the source of knowledge. He's not the bearer of knowledge. So when I put it in metonymic terms, then it's okay. So that's the Ismaili approach. But the other approach that you find is so if you're on this tradition, will say that God is identical to his knowledge and his wisdom. Okay, so they'll opt for a different semantics. They'll say God is identical to his attributes of life, knowledge, power, wisdom. Now, personally, I think we're saying the same thing. Okay, and the difference here is a difference of semantic theories. But personally, I think, and this is just my opinion, if I were to defend divine simplicity today against analytic philosophers, I think that Ismaili semantics will do better, because you can't accuse the Ismailis of equivocating on what things mean, whereas I already know that the Thomists are often, I'm not saying the Thomists are wrong, I'm just saying like the Thomists face this problem from the likes of Plantinga and Craig, and where they're like, oh, but when you say God is knowing, and when you say, you know, Bob is knowing, you're equivocating on the word knowing. Now, I'm sure there are answers to that, but I just feel like the articulation on divine simplicity is just more clear, and it's less susceptible to some of the analytic attacks that we see today. So that's the difference in predication theories.
Yeah, so Khalil, we could do one of two things at this point. We could either go into the Neoplatonic arguments for God's existence, or we could look at Islamic sources like the Quran and Hadith for just like verification or validation of the kind of model that you're proposing. Which one do you want to go to?
I apologize. You cut out. I didn't hear the choices. If you could just repeat them.
Yeah. So we could either go forward with the arguments for the existence of God, or we could go just to the Quran and Hadith to just see, you know, at least from the Islamic sources, the validation of this view.
I heard we can either do arguments for existence of God, or we can do the validation of the Ismaili view. Is that correct?
Yeah, from the Quran and Hadith.
Okay. Well, let me start with this. One thing I think it's important argument for divine simplicity that the Islamic Neoplatonists gave.
Sure.
So this is not the argument for God. Well, maybe we should just start with that. So there are different arguments for God, but I would say there's like three arguments that Islamic Neoplatonists use. One argument is very similar to Plotinus. It's an argument that Edward Feser gave in his book, like he called it the Platinian or the Neoplatonic argument, and that's the argument for reality. I'm not going to go through the detail, but because Edward Feser has explained it, right? But the gist of the argument is, a given existent, right? It either is complex or it's simple, right? And if something is complex, then it has constituents, and then the same question can be asked about the constituents, right? These are either simple or complex. Eventually, you will have to conclude, you'll have to reach a level of reality that is absolutely simple, right? That cannot be constituted or decomposed, even conceptually, any further. And that absolutely simple reality, it will turn out that you can only have one absolutely simple reality, because if you had more than one absolutely simple reality, they would each need to have some differential feature to be different from the other absolutely simple reality, but then they're not absolutely simple. So you end up with the conclusion that there's only one absolutely simple reality, and then you do a series of negations. Absolutely simple reality cannot be material, it cannot be temporal, it doesn't change, it's immutable, it's timeless, and so on. So that's like a stock Neoplatonic argument, and Ismailis have used that argument. Another kind of argument that we find in God is a what I would call a dependency argument. Some Ismaili philosophers, this is a little bit before Avicenna. So one Ismaili philosopher named Kirmani, he offered a dependency argument, which is basically like some things exist, some things depend on other things. It is impossible that all things are dependent, right? It's impossible that everything in reality is dependent. Logically speaking, it is necessary that an independent reality exists to ground all other realities. And there are different arguments on why you cannot have an infinite regress of only dependent realities. And I have an article under review arguing for at least 4 reasons why everything in reality cannot only be dependent. So this argument argues for an absolutely independent reality, right? So aseity. And then from there, it goes on to through the usual deductions, that the absolutely independent reality is absolutely simple, and then it also transcends attributes and time, space, change, mutability, passivity, and this sort of thing. So that's another argument that you find in tradition. I'm just doing this fast because I'm just trying to give your audience the lay of the land. I think people are familiar with this contingency argument. It's different from modern contingency arguments, though. Okay, so I need to be very clear. When Ibn Sina argues that God is the necessary existence in itself, and when he makes a rational argument for the logical necessity of necessary existence in itself, he's not talking about possible worlds, right? This is not a argument of, oh, contingent things exist in some possible worlds, but there has to be something that exists in all possible worlds, and that thing is God. That's not Ibn Sina's argument. Ibn Sina is a necessitarian. All Islamic Neoplatonists are necessitarian. We only believe in one possible world, right? For us, there's just one possible world, which is this. So when we say something is contingent, what we really mean is that something considered by itself, right? It may exist or it may not exist, considered by itself. That's what it means to be contingent. So for something that's contingent in itself to actually exist, it depends on a cause. That's what makes something contingent or not possible worlds. And similarly, for Ibn Sina, God is the necessary existence in himself. What that means is that God exists independently, right? Independent existence, self grounded existence. That's what it means to be necessary in itself. The argument, where for the modern modal philosophers, they start by saying a necessary being is that which exists in all possible worlds. But guess what? You could have a being that exists in all possible worlds that in all possible worlds depends on another thing. That would still be a modally necessary being in one framework, right? It exists in all possible worlds, but it depends on God. So these Islam arguments, if I may say so, are far superior to these analytic arguments for necessary beings, because we mean different things by necessary beings. So Ibn Sina's argument is probably the most famous in the tradition, and it is a deductive argument. And again, Edward Fazer has a whole blog post on it. And if you read the text of Ibn Sina, it is a bit different from Aquinas's contingency argument. Because remember, for the whole Islamic Neoplatonic tradition, for the whole tradition, the intellect and the soul, and for many people, even the universe, these created realities are eternal. So the standard Kalam cosmological argument that says the universe begins and therefore whatever begins to exist has a cause, and so the beginning universe has a cause. These standard Kalam arguments are sort of ineffective for this worldview. They may go to a certain point, but they don't really work. These Kalam, any argument that relies on something having a beginning, therefore it's been created, those arguments, the Islamic Neoplatonists are not really big fans of those. They're just arguments. They don't go far enough, and more. So you have these different arguments used to prove God, and I know some people say an independent reality or a necessary being, that's not God. Like, that's not the God of Scripture, right? So one thing to note is that the God that you describe negatively, right? Independent, beyond time, beyond space, right? Beyond matter. In this case, eternally creating everything. In Islamic Neoplatonic traditions, this is what we mean by God. Because, like, God is not a mere person, God doesn't have emotions, God doesn't change, right? God doesn't intervene in creation in real time for us. So for us, the deductive arguments prove exactly what we want. we don't need to add on all this extra baggage about God having like a personality and emotional states. And I know even Thomists and Catholics, they don't believe that about God either. I know some Protestants do, right? But we don't really have a gap between what the argument shows and the concept of God that's operative within these various traditions, whether Sufi, Ismaili, just share is given that this is hotly debated. You have on the slide here is an argument for divine simplicity, the argument that God must be absolutely simple without any real distinct attributes. And this is an argument that you find from the various Muslim philosophers. So the Ismailis gave this argument, and Ibn Sina gave, and this is a very strong argument that even other Muslims who are not Neoplatonists, they really had a hard time contending with this argument. This argument is as follows. If you suppose that a God exists, let's say we've already proven God deductively, right? So you have God, and if you suppose that God, who is independent, say, has a real distinct attribute, right? So this would be, if you suppose the position of what today people call neoclassical theism, if you just suppose that, we would say that that position will actually collapse into one of your outcomes, right? And the position will collapse because once you say God has an attribute that is not numerically identical to himself, then you need to answer the question about the ontology of that attribute. So what I mean by that is, does God depend on the attribute? Or does the attribute depend on God? Or is God and this real attribute that's not identical to himself, are they both independent or are they both dependent? So you see, that's 4 options. So under option 1, if you said God's essence depends on this attribute, it doesn't matter how many attributes you say. Let's say God depends on these attributes to exist. Okay, so that means you have a divine attribute or more that are necessary independent realities. And that would actually be multiple necessary beings, depending on how many attributes you have. If you say there's one attribute and God depends on that attribute, well, then that attribute is God. And God is actually contingent because it's necessary through another, right? Let's say that, and this is what I've noticed a lot of people doing today, let's say that the attributes that we're positing, they depend on God. So God is independent, but the attributes are dependent on him. If you choose that route, from a Neoplatonic perspective, that is divine simplicity. Because there's only one necessary independent being, and these divine attributes that are but dependent on God, they're no different from Neoplatonic emanations. So you still have divine simplicity. And what you mean by God, you just end up equivocating on what the word God means. Sometimes you mean only the independent reality that grounds the attributes, and sometimes you'll say, no, it means the essence and the attributes. And this is just an equivocation on the term God, but it really is divine simplicity. Obviously, then, if you said that God and his attributes are all independent, you have a polytheism, right? You have multiple necessary beings, which is actually logically impossible, but it should already be problematic as polytheism. And finally, if you said that God and his attributes, they all depend on something, maybe they depend on each other. So I've seen some social Trinitarian friends say that the Father, Son, Holy Spirit are interdependent and they just depend on each other in this circular way. Well, you'd have vicious circular, which is not possible. And there would have to be some higher reality over and above God and the attributes that grounds them. So that would be a wholly contingent God. So what we would argue then is divine simplicity logically must be true, because as soon as you assume that divine simplicity is not true and you introduce a real distinct attribute that's with God but not identical to him, your position will have to collapse into one of these four. And I think this is a cogent argument. I have not really seen any analytic theologian deal with this, despite apart from just choosing number two and insisting that number two is not divine simplicity, which I think it is.
Right. So if I could hop in then, so on option number two, when you talk about the let's say attributes depending on God, would you to make sure I'm getting this right? You talk about they're really emanations. So are we talking about the universal intellect and soul here, or is that a different thing?
Well, if you say that the attributes are not identical to God, but they depend on God eternally, right?
Yeah.
Metaphysically speaking, you're talking about the equivalent of the Neoplatonic intellect and Neoplatonic soul.
Okay.
Because what is the intellect for us is the direct procession from God, and it eternally depends on God. That's what the intellect is. We don't say that the intellect is God or it's part of God, because the intellect is dependent. And for us, right, God cannot be dependent in any way. God must be independent. So anything that is not identical to God, even if it's eternal, depends on God. Whether you call it an attribute, whether you call it an emanation, its ontological status, remains unchanged. So that's why and there are some schools of Islamic thought that do say, they like, the Ismailis are included, and the Sufis are like this. A lot of us will put the divine attributes ordinarily understood, so knowledge as something distinct from power. A lot of us will say that these exist in the intellects. We don't have a problem anymore. They're dependent, they exist, they're part of the intellect, and they depend on God, and that's it. So a lot of us in Islamic Neoplatonism, we of number two over here. Like, we've already done that. And I've noticed some analytic theologians seeing the problem, they're now starting to go for number two. I just read a paper the other day. I forgot the person's name. I think somebody by the name of Fowler, if I have the name right, has proposed. Our answer is very easy. Under number two, these attributes are really not divine. If something is dependent, it cannot be divine. It's just a eternal emanation or an eternal effect of the divine. And then we would say, okay, this is divine simplicity, which we sort of already believe in.
All right, Khalil. Maybe we can move on to some other questions here now. And you let me know if you're like, oh, I want to touch on something before we move on or anything like that. All right. So I guess the question that a lot of people are going to have is, why have a universal intellect and universal soul? Why not just say God himself created, right? And just have it be, if you will, a direct kind of creation, rather than having these intermediary realities. So why have this in your model?
So that's a very good question. So there are several arguments that we would put together, that we would use to argue why the intellect and the soul in the Ismaili model are logically necessary. So one argument, if you argue from below, okay, so if we start by contemplating the cosmos, right, I would use basically a Platonic argument, or the divine conceptualist argument. So this idea that although the physical cosmos may be changing, it's in a state of flux, right, all the time. The sheer contemplation of the physical cosmos, including things like just modern science, it logically necessitates that eternal exist. Okay, so there are truths that we contemplate with our intellects that have the character of being timeless truths, like mathematical truths, for example. The laws of logic in propositional form seem to be eternal truths, right? Truths about possible worlds, like just what is logically possible and what's not, those are eternal truths. Geometric figures are eternal truths. So, Augustine made this type of argument, Leibniz made this argument, Plotinus made this argument. So the idea is that by reflecting on the physical world, some eternal truths exist. We can debate about how many there are, right? One could, if you're an essentialist, say things like red and blue and triangularity, that these are also eternal truths. Again, Edward Feser's chapter is really good on this, the divine conceptualist argument. So if you take this argument from eternal truths, it follows then that eternal truths are intelligible content, right? They're not material, and intelligible content must be grounded by an intellect. Intelligible content can't just float around, right? Intelligible content, by definition, is the thought of an intellect. So what many theists do is have respect for those theists because they argue the point well. What was they take these eternal truths, mathematics, logic, necessity, possibility, maybe things of truths about structures. They put those eternal truths in the mind of God, right? This is where, as a Neoplatonist, I would beg to differ, and I would say, look, if we're already committed to divine simplicity, if we've already established divine simplicity, and we know that there have to be a eternal truths existing in an eternal mind, well, it's very easy then. These eternal truths, they do have to exist in an intellect, but it cannot be God. It has to be something that is a little bit more complex than God. And that eternal mind that is eternally thinking eternal truths, that would be the universal intellect. Again, from strong divine simplicity, this is the inevitable conclusion of the argument. In my opinion, you cannot put the eternal truths in an absolutely simple God, because the truths themselves are not simple. Like, the eternal truths have some complexity. So we would put them in substance of the universal intellect, right? So that's an argument for the intellect from below. There's also an argument for the intellect from above. So we have a principle in Islamic philosophy called the rule of one. The rule of one says that an absolutely simple reality, God, can only emanate or can only issue numerically one effect. I'll repeat it. The absolutely simple reality, logically speaking, can only emanate numerically one effect. It cannot emanate 2, 3, 4 effects. And the reason for that is that if God issued or emanated multiple effects, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 effects, it would require real multiplicity within God to explain the existence of these multiple effects. But because God is absolutely simple, there is no diversity within God, right? There are no real distinctions within God. Because God is absolutely simple, right? There can only be numerically one effect or numerically one procession that is the direct effect of God. Because reality has to unfold in this gradual way. Otherwise, divine simplicity will be violated. Now, I have two more arguments for that principle, but I just gave you the basic one. So if you accepted the argument, okay, so there's one effect that comes from God, right? One direct effect. This direct effect would be evil. It would always exist. If it was temporal, that would require change, in our opinion anyway. If the first effect was a temporal effect, that would require temporality within God. Something would change within God to make the first effect exist at a certain moment. But because God is eternal, we argue that the first effect is also eternal. So you have a first effect that is both eternal and singular, right? And this first effect, it can't be physical because physical things are matter and form, right? Matter, form, composites, right? And because only one thing can come from God, you can't have matter and form both emanate directly from God. So, not being a matter form, the first effect would be incorporeal, which is basically what we call an intellect, like a wholly incorporeal being. So that would be the argument from above, to have an intellect, a universal intellect.
All right, Khalil. Let me do this. Let me ask you like three more questions, and would you be open to taking in audience questions as well?
Yeah, we can do that. Sure.
Yeah, and I'll try to keep this like, maybe right now we're hitting about 1 hour, 6 minutes. So maybe like about 1:30, I'll check and just see, where we are and all that, okay? Because I know that
Sure.
you're busy and you got things to do. So Khalil, I have three questions, right? And we're now going to get into more like objections, right, to this Neoplatonic model. So the first is that I heard this claim online that Neoplatonists have to deny creation ex nihilo, that God created from nothing. I thought that was a bit of a bizarre claim, but I wanted to get your take on it.
Sure. So, I think the problem with this claim is that there actually seems to be different understandings of creation ex nihilo. Uh, I can tell you that in Ismaili texts, they are very clear that God creates, eternally creates, the first intellect from nothing, in the sense that there is no thingness that sort of pre-exists with God that he's getting the intellect from, right? Uh, so, in the sense, creation ex nihilo in Islamic Neoplatonism is interpreted to mean that God alone is the sufficient condition for the existence of the intellect. There is nothing alongside God. There's no pre-existing matter or no pre-existing form that God is going to use as a resource to originate the intellect. So that is what we mean by creation ex nihilo. But I think, again, the problem is always, and I hate to say it, but there's a lot of problems with analytic theology, uh, where they take a very ahistorical approach to theology, right? So one of my gripes with analytic theologians is they tend not to sort of be very literate in like historical expressions of philosophy, and they sometimes they do arbitrarily define terms. I still see this going on. So some analytic theologians will just arbitrarily say that creation ex nihilo must be temporal generation, and therefore they say that eternal creation is not creation ex nihilo. Well, yeah, if you arbitrarily define creation ex nihilo in your own way, then you can say we deny it. But our texts, we have an Arabic term called ibda. Ibda means origination. It's believe in ibda. It's how God or and ibda is defined as the bringing into being of existence from non-existence. And so that is creation ex nihilo. But again, what we mean by creation ex nihilo is God alone is the sufficient condition and the perfect cause of the intellect. God does not require, anything else. So I would say no, we don't deny creation ex nihilo. We deny temporal creation on the part of God, but we don't deny creation itself.
All right, second question. How do you approach modal collapse objections?
Sorry, did you add another objection? I didn't hear what you said before the word
Sorry,
objection.
yeah. So I said basically, second question, how do you approach modal collapse arguments?
Okay, okay. Very good, very good. So, modal collapse, do you want to explain what modal collapse is, or you want me to?
I can give my shot and then you tell me if I have it right because I've been out of the game for a bit. But okay, I'll give it a shot. Okay, Khalil. Okay, so I think the basic claim of the modal collapse argument is if you have a God who is divinely simple, let's say pure act, he has no potentialities within him, then whatever he creates seems to also, like, how do you avoid basically creation itself also being without any potentiality and also kind of almost being pure act in a way, such that everything just becomes absolutely necessary. There are no alternate possibilities in creation. You lose the modality that you typically want in a metaphysical view of the world. Um, would you agree with that characterization?
Yeah, I all through, but I think that I grasp enough of what you said.
Yeah.
So the apparent problem with modal collapse, right, is that if God is simple, creation is inevitable, right? This particular creation is inevitable, and therefore things as they are could not have been any other way up till now, and uh, there is no contingency. Everything is necessary. God and creation are both necessary. That's the modal collapse objection. So I just an article responding to this argument in the European Journal of Analytic Philosophy, and it's an open access article. So I would invite people to read that. But the Islamic response, the Islamic Neoplatonic response to this argument is actually very, very easy. And until I actually took the time to do the research, I didn't realize like we had such an easy response. So the response is basically this. It is true that this modal collapse argument is valid, such that everything, God and creation, are necessary. This is true if necessary is defined in a possible worlds framework and contingency is defined in a possible worlds framework. So again, in a possible worlds framework, necessary means to exist in all possible worlds, and contingent means to exist in some possible worlds, but not all, right? And impossible would be, to exist in no possible worlds. I would say, yeah, in a possible worlds framework, you have what this so-called modal collapse. But the real kicker here is that this is not a real problem, because possible worlds modality is different from ontological necessity and ontological contingency. What do the latter mean? Ontological necessity is something that is there in this rolls out. Ontological contingency simply means that something depends on other things to exist. Okay, so if you actually take your magnifying glass into the possible worlds framework, you may have everything in this world exists in all possible worlds, God and creation. That may be true, but something may be inevitable. Creation may be inevitable, but creation, which is modally necessary in the possible worlds framework, creation is not ontologically necessary. It still depends on God. So we Islamic philosophers, when you say, oh, modal collapse, we'll say, yeah, well, we eat modal collapses for breakfast. Like, we already knew about this. We knew about this 1,000 years ago. We embraced this, actually, because for us, what makes God unique and distinguished from what is not God is not mere existence in all possible worlds. That's a very low bar for God, to be honest, right? Like, mere possible world, because guess what? Like, 2 + 2 = 4 also exists in all possible worlds. Are you going to worship math now? Right? So existence in all possible worlds is a very low bar for divinity, and I hope people don't base their notion of God on that. Real necessity, ontological necessity, is independent reality. So even though there's only one possible world, which is right here, Okay, we are all necessary in one sense, but God is necessary in himself. Everything other than God, from the intellect onward, is necessary through another. So there is no modal collapse in ontological modality. So this is a completely phantom issue. And in fact, I would go further, and I've done that in my article. I would say that if you believe in liberty and free will for God, you run into far worse problems. You run into the problem of brute contingency, right? If creation could have been otherwise, but it's this particular way, and God is simple, why? What is it about God that makes creation this way as opposed to the other way, which apparently it could have been in a libertarian model? And what people end up doing is they rely on self-explanation. In some sense, the contingent, nothing in the simple God or even a complex God. There's nothing in the necessary aspect of God to explain in a libertarian model why this universe obtains over any other universe. So then people will say something like, well, this universe's own existence is somehow part of the explanation for its own existence. Well, this is just circularity, and this is brute contingency. So I've argued, I end my article by saying all theists, classical and non-classical, should embrace this modal collapse as a matter of necessity.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's such an interesting response, and the idea that the possible worlds framework might be the one that's really causing us problems here. I mean, I've heard other classical theists also say they don't like talking in possible worlds and things like that. So that's encouraging to hear. All right, here's my last question, and then we'll get to some audience questions. So, speaking of divine revelation and God interacting with the world, right? I mean, God having prophets, God having saints, God sending angels, and these other things, right? How in the Neoplatonic model does God interact and speak to the world?
Okay, very good question. So at the outset, let me be very clear. That Muslims held, and in many other models that are not Neoplatonic. So some of the Kalam would agree with us. God does not directly emit linguistic auditory speech. So let's get that out of the way. So I'll repeat. For Islamic Neoplatonists and for many of the Kalam theologians as well, Asharis, Maturidis, God directly emit linguistic auditory speech. Okay, so this very layman understanding of God speaking, right? We deny that because it doesn't make any sense. Okay, because remember I explained the rule of one, so the rule of one is still applies. So what comes directly from God is his single creative act, which manifests as the universal intellect. Okay, so in a metaphysical sense, God's speech metaphysically is his creation of the intellect. So God is eternally speaking in that sense. Okay, again, this is not linguistic speech. This is, you could call it, ontological speech. So God eternally issues an ontological speech, and that is his very act of creation. And that act of creation is eternal. So God is speaking right now. And every level of creation, intellect, the soul, the physical world, humans, every level of creation by very nature is a manifestation of God's ontological speech. So you look outside, that is the speech of God manifested. The moral intuitions that you have within your soul when you reflect on what the right thing to do is, your moral intuitions, although we don't have perfect moral intuition, but when we get it right, when our intellect, when we use the laws of logic and we arrive at a truth, that is God's speech. So in a broad sense, God is speaking eternally, and every human being has partial access to the divine speech, the cosmic divine speech. Everything in nature is a reflection or a mirror of God's speech. So, in some sense, revelation is a cosmic process that never ceases, it's always going on. That's why the Quran says that everything in nature, the trees, the plants, the clouds, the mountains, everything is an ayah or sign of God. And you may know that the word ayah is used in the Quran to talk about a verse of Quran as well as something in nature or within the human soul. So the Quran already gives us a natural theology where everything by its very existence is a form of revelation. So that's like the starting point. Now, what then happens is that there are particular processes within the world that are more intense manifestations of revelation. Because let's face it, we could all go outside right now. Most people will not perceive the sunset as a revelation of God, right? Most people will just see it as a sunset. So most people need a more intense, a more direct, a more transparent manifestation of God's speech. So what happens is that if you look on my diagram here, they're individual souls, right? So the universal produces individual souls. Now, some of the individual souls that are produced by the universal soul are perfect, meaning that they are optimally receptive to the flow of God's speech that's flowing on the chain. So those souls that are perfect in their reception of God's speech, i.e., God's ontological speech. So the great prophets, right? Adam, Noah, Abraham, Ismail, Isaac, Jacob, David, Solomon, John the Baptist. For us Muslims, Jesus, Prophet Muhammad. They are souls that are so they're like pure mirrors, right? So if the sun is shining outside, and if you look outside and there's a bunch of rocks, the rocks barely capture the sunlight. But if I take a mirror outside, the sunlight will glow and reflect in that mirror. So the souls of the prophets are like these mirrors, and they reflect to the best degree that a human soul can reflect. They reflect God's creative action. So they are the reflections of the universal intellect and the soul in our world. And they are receiving emanation. Just like a mirror, when reflecting an image, the mirror is receiving light from the original object, right? It is light or emanation from this neo hierarchy. So a prophet receives this emanation in a spiritual manner, and the prophet has the ability to articulate that spiritual emanation as communication, as words, such as the Quran, such as the parables of Jesus, such as these articulations you find in the prophets of Israel, that the Bible has recorded a lot of, right? Isaiah or Jeremiah. So the prophets are actually the translators, the emanation. They translate into human language, so that brings us in touch with a more intense manifestation of God's speech than the natural world. So that's what revelation is, and that translation of the divine emanation, those words will be special. They'll have a special quality to them. They might have a special literary quality. So what Muslims believe about the Quran is that the Quran has literary qualities that are unique, right? Many people call it a miracle, but what that's getting at is that the Quran, as a set of utterances, it's a intense manifestation of God's ontological speech. We would say the same about the words of Jesus, right? If we could recover the exact words of Jesus, like his parables and his teachings, we would find there's something unique about this that distinguished Jesus from everybody. And you'll find similar things in the teachings of past prophets. There's something about their speech that's unique. will indicate that this is not just ordinary human speech. This is divinely inspired speech. So that's our theory of revelation. And broadly speaking, all the Islamic Neoplatonists believe this theory of revelation, the Ismailis, Ibn Sina. And this also means that prophet as an individual plays a creative role in formulating the precise words of the Quran. The Quran is not just verbally dictated to the prophet like he's some automaton. He receives revelation or inspiration immaterially, and he translates it into words and symbols and parables that are best suited to the people of his time. And this brings the Islamic Neoplatonic theory of revelation a little bit closer to some, not all, but some Christian theories of inspiration. Right. I know there's a lot of diversity, but I know some Catholics, maybe some Protestants, they see prophecy as a thing of divine inspiration as opposed to divine dictation. So here, the Neoplatonic traditions of Islam, we believe in divine inspiration. We don't believe in divine dictation. So in some, for us, revelation is a cosmic process. It's happening all the time. You and I, if we quieted down our soul, but there are certain human souls, due to their spiritual perfection and receptivity, they receive an intense influx of this continuous cosmic revelation, and they also translate that emanation for the multitude. So that's what we call prophetic word in scripture.
Khalil, I found your presentation today and everything that you've been talking about to be so exciting on so many levels and intellectually, refreshing, to hear you express these things, and especially from a different tradition than my own, but nonetheless seeing this shared philosophical worldview. Khalil, I'd love to have you back on to maybe do some dialogues with other classical theists from the Catholic tradition, because there's actually a lot here that amazes me actually in how much we share in common, with respect to the nature of God and revelation and so forth. All right. Well, Khalil, let me now get to some audience questions.
There is.
Is that okay? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Actually, no. Go ahead and say what you're going to say. Sorry, I heard some silence, and I thought, yeah.
Yeah, I think we're on a bit of a lag. No, I just think there's a bit of a lag between us. No, there is a lot in common, and we shouldn't be surprised, because the Christian scholastic tradition that Catholics revere, that tradition, Aquinas and Scotus and these people, they read Avicenna, right? They read Ibn Sina, they read Farabi, they read Ibn Rushd. People don't know that many of the Greek Neoplatonic ideas, they made their way into Latin Europe by way of Arabic translation, right? So the knowledge, the Greek Neoplatonic heritage was first recovered by the Arabs and the Persians, translated into Arabic. Then it goes to Latin Europe and is translated into Latin, right? And then Aquinas and all these people are reading this stuff, and Aquinas is appropriating like what he thinks is in line with the Catholic faith. We will find a lot of these common things, even terms like procession or emanation. Aquinas uses these terms. He may use it to talk about the Trinity, and we may use it to talk about the Neoplatonic. The terms are there. So should not be surprised that we find these common things. And again, it goes to what I said earlier, right? Theological dialogue is not really divided on Christian versus Muslim. It's really about a group of Christians and a group of Muslims are adhering to similar paradigms, and they may be on the same side of certain issues, like divine simplicity or divine timelessness. These are issues that are dividing Christians with Christians, and they're dividing Muslims with Muslims. There's a few Muslims today who unfortunately are not very grounded in actual Islamic thought, and they have sort of attached onto some of the Protestant analytic work where that people are saying that God is powerful like this. So division Muslims were like, what do you mean God is temporal? Like, that doesn't make any sense. Like, nobody said this, right? So there are many issues where Catholics, sometimes Orthodox, and certain kinds of Muslims will actually be on the same side of that debate. And there are other issues we would be on different sides, and that's okay too.
Yeah, and I'd like to explain to the audience as well that the reason why I'm having you on the show is to help me learn more about not only having this kind of interreligious dialogue, but also to learn more about Neoplatonism and the current literature. Because I was living as a Dominican friar for a few months, and so I wasn't actively reading in the philosophy literature. And so I thought about with the modal collapse objection when you kind of clarified it for me, and I realized, oh yeah, that's literally what I read when I read the papers. So you helped kind of bring that back to mind, because what I said kind of sounded more like determinism, not necessarily what modal collapse is getting at. So I appreciate, Khalil, you helping me refresh my memory on some of these issues. All right, well, hopefully the lag isn't too bad. Let me get to some questions now from the audience. So I have this question here, and let me see if I'll get it to be this way. Khalil, there's a question from El Lobo. It says, I was told in Islam, God is not a spirit. Is that true? Let's see. Let's see. Hey, Khalil, can you hear me all right? Let's see. Oh, okay. All right. So Khalil just needs a quick minute, real quick. There we go. Yeah, but yeah, I mean, so now we're getting into audience questions, and so I don't know, Khalil, if you heard everything I said, but I just wanted to thank you for helping me refresh some of my memory on these things to get more precision in what I was saying, especially with the modal collapse stuff. When you explained that it's about creation itself seemingly being a necessary thing, I was like, okay, yeah, that helps. Refresh my memory on it. Well, Khalil, you let me know when you're ready.
Sorry, there's some vacuuming close to do.
All right, you ready?
I think I can answer the first one. Yes. So God is not a spirit. Is that true? Well, we use the term spirit. Sorry, again. Give me a second.
Yeah, and also for the people in the chat, how am I glitching, or am I fairly clear as well? Because I might need to maybe change my Wi-Fi or something. But am I okay for those in the chat? Also, there's a lot of good questions coming in, and I just wish our connection was better so that we could get to them more seamlessly. All right, there we go. So Khalil might need a second. Okay, well, let's see. Khalil might have to step out real quick to fix some stuff, and then he'll be back hopefully. I'm gonna. I don't know if I want to tackle questions without him, because there are some questions here that are actually about Catholic theology that I'm kind of jumping to mention, because in a lot of what Khalil was saying, I wanted to kind of share the Catholic perspective on it, but because of the bad connection, I didn't want to speak too much and then have things lost. And then Khalil's like, "Wait, what did you say?" And then I'm like, "Wait, you said this," and then having bad connection makes a conversation difficult. Okay. So yeah, I mean, I think as we wait for Khalil to join again, I mean, it would be really cool to see Joshua Sijuwadi and Khalil Andani talk about the Trinity. Yeah, I mean, so let's see. Okay, he's back. There we go. All right.
Okay,
Khalil,
okay. Sorry about that.
yeah.
Somebody is vacuuming, and it was going to block out my sound.
Mhm.
Okay, the first question. I was told in Islam, God is not a spirit. Is that true? Yeah. So we would not say God is a spirit.
Mm,
Frankly, I don't think Christians would say God is a in the Quran, the term spirit, right, is used for created beings. Um, Spirit is not a Quranic name of God. So, firstly, so we don't use it. But also, in our different philosophical worldviews, uh, we use the term spirit to talk about the immaterial, incorporeal, but created dimension of human beings and other things, right? So, we would say the human soul is a spirit, an
mm,
angel is a spirit, right? A jinn may be a spirit. So we use the term spirit to refer to immaterial, incorporeal creatures. And therefore, we don't say God is a spirit because that would literally be assimilating God to a created level of reality. Just like you would not say God is a body. Again,
mm,
nobody would say God is a body, right? We would not say God is a thing because things are finite. Uh,
mm,
so God is not a spirit. And likewise, you would not say God is a being
mm.
because a being is something finite, right? Something delimited. So that's why we would not say God is a spirit. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Mhm. All right. Here's another question from K. Kasam. The question is, do you think Catholic theology is a Christianized, let's say, or Christian form of Neoplatonism?
I don't know. I don't know enough about Catholic theology and sort of how diverse it could be. Um, I have read certain thinkers like Wolfgang Smith, who I believe is a Catholic, and he may call himself a Platonist as well. So I think I mean, Christian Platonism is something that definitely exists, right?
Hmm.
But I think in Christian Platonism, what they would probably do is they would see the what we call the universal intellect. They would functionally they would say, well, this is the Son of God, this is the
Yeah.
Logos, and therefore
Hmm.
that would count as divine, right? So I don't think if Neoplatonists have defined it here, where like God is absolutely simple without any sort of distinctions. I don't think you would find Catholic or Christian Neoplatonism. But again, if you just go into Google Books, you will find a phenomenon called Christian Platonism. So I
Mm,
think there is a way of the principles that I talked about and sort of rearranging them in a Trinitarian framework, and I think that would be Christian Platonism. I haven't really seen the term Christian Neoplatonism, but if not,
mm.
maybe we'll do it. I don't know.
Yeah, I was just going to add here, from my perspective, in the Catholic tradition, a lot of philosophers and theologians have talked about like the Neoplatonic strands within Aquinas's thought, especially his proof for the existence of God and the De Ante et Essentia, where basically Aquinas has a metaphysics of participation, wherein created things, for their essay, or to use the lack of a better term, existence, participates, depends upon, in the greater essay that is God Himself, right? So I mean, there is definitely participation metaphysics in Aquinas's thought, and so that would fit quite well with like a Neoplatonic framework. Um, so there are bits and elements of Neoplatonism in Catholic theology. And then, as you said, Khalil, about how a Neoplatonist or a Catholic would try to maybe make the universal intellect and universal soul, the processions from God, somehow into a Trinitarian framework, that would definitely, I think, sound appealing to a Catholic. And then also, just I think the distinction would then be between like a Catholic and a Muslim Neoplatonist. The Catholic would say that the universal soul and intellect, if we can, if and this is just speculating, right? I'm not saying that this is what I'm committed to or what anybody's necessarily committed to. They would say that the universal intellect and soul is consubstantial with God, right? So it's not, you know, let's say a lesser God, right? It is definitely properly called God, the Lord God, what have you. So with that, let's see. You know, and Khalil, do you mind if I ask you a question here really quick? Because I think this audience question is prompting me to ask, I'm inspired to ask another question. Khalil, are you there? Okay,
Yeah,
sure.
go ahead.
So, you know, there's a philosopher, Catholic philosopher named Joshua Sijuwati, and he has his view of the Trinity, and it sounds remarkably similar to yours. I mean, just have you looked, read, or know about Joshua Sijuwati at all, or anything like that?
Yeah, I know him. I know him personally. I have my
Hmm.
Facebook friend, and I've seen his work and I've read his work. And I actually, there actually is a lot of commonality between his Trinity model and this Neoplatonic model. It's not exactly the same. I
Hmm.
would say this, that if you put the theology aside, right? If you sort of put by theology, I mean the conclusion that, the Son and the Spirit are consubstantial with the Father, and
Hmm.
identical to the one God. If you put some of that aside for a second, and if you just look at the philosophical concepts that Sijuwati uses to articulate the Trinity, the concept of grounding, when we would use the same thing, right? Like I would argue that Neoplatonic emanation, right, or procession, the procession of the intellect from God and the emanation from the intellect. This is what would be called grounding, or you would use today's theories of grounding that Sijuwati
Hmm.
uses for his Trinity. We would use the same thing to talk about the Neoplatonic hierarchy, right?
Hmm.
So philosophically, there I could see it being very similar. And even if we just looked at the top process over here, how's the intellect grounded by God or the One? Sijuwadi's work would be quite useful. If I were to explain to an analytic audience, like, what is this
Hmm.
Neoplatonic thing, I would use his work because he's done a lot of the legwork, right? He's found a concept of contemporary metaphysics that can explain how something can be eternal but dependent, right? So
Yeah.
I think it's very good work. Now, you can use that for the Trinity, or you can use it for Neoplatonism, and that's a point that I made in a lecture last year. Was there's a lot of resources in contemporary philosophy of religion. I can use many of the same popular arguments, but I build the Neoplatonic worldview. I don't have to build, a Christian,
Hmm.
Swinburnian worldview or Plantingian worldview or Craigian worldview. I'm not limited to that. I can use all the same stuff, possibly I would argue in a more consistent way. And I can build this worldview. So yeah, I think Josh Sijuwata's work is very good, and I say that about a lot of, there's a lot of work by people who theologically we are not in the same boat,
Hmm.
but it's still good work. And I am happy to engage anybody who I think is doing good work, even if our theological conclusions are different.
MK MK Vine asks, has Khalil read on Blessed Duns Scotus's formal distinction category, and what's his take on it?
I've read very little on it, very
Mm.
little. Like by little, I mean I've just read some secondary literature on it. So
Hmm.
anything I say about it has to be qualified that I speak about it as a layman, because I don't. My focus is not medieval Christian theology. From what I gathered about formal distinction, I think in my Neoplatonic model, I would use formal distinction to explain what is going on inside the universal intellect. I am not
Mm.
comfortable with formal distinctions in the absolutely simple God. Obviously,
Mm.
Scotus thinks differently, and that's fine. But just based on what I know, um, formal distinction, in my opinion, it's too distinct to accept at the level of God or the One. And I'm what you would call like a very strict, strong proponent of divine simplicity. So as
Hmm.
soon as if I detect any hint of distinction Within God, I refrain from it.
Okay. Let me get a few more questions here, then I think we can wrap up the stream. So Khalil, MK Vine also asked again, what is Khalil's view on the essence energies distinction from an Islamic Neoplatonist point of view? We're talking now more Eastern Orthodox theology. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I'm still trying to find the sort of framework Islamically to understand the essence energy distinction. From one perspective, right, the energies look like Neoplatonic emanations from one perspective, right? Like there are these eternal, like, well, some of them, most of them are eternal, I think. They're, for the most part, they're these eternal acts of the essence, right? So from one perspective, they look like Neoplatonic emanations, except there's many of them instead of just one direct emanation. So sometimes it looks like that, but other times when I read about it or I have conversations about it, sometimes the energies look a lot like the Sunni Kalam divine attributes. So the Sunni Kalam tradition says that, God has, for example, the Ash'ari say God has 7 attributes. They're eternal. They subsist in his essence, but they're not his essence. Sometimes these divine energies actually resemble the uncreated subsistent attributes of Sunni theology, and some people have felt that as well. So, so to be honest, I'm not really sure like which concepts in the Islamic tradition correlate to the essence energies. I'm not sure yet because I haven't done that type of comparative work, but maybe somebody will do it.
I think maybe there's one. Okay, so let me hit this one question, and then and then there's another one that's been asked a few times that I know, like this is they're asking about when in the Quran when it talks about God having body parts, and I'm like, you had a whole debate with the Muslim metaphysician on that, so I don't know if you want to rehash that question at all.
Yeah, I mean, sure. Look, the Quran has many expressions that mention God's hand, God's face, God's eye, right? God's 2 hands. So, for example, there's a verse that says, "Wherever you turn, there is the face of Allah."
Mm-hmm.
There's another verse that says, "Everything will perish except His face." So, the Neoplatonic answer to this, especially in the Ismaili tradition, is quite interesting. We interpret these so-called body parts phrases. We say that this actually refers to the Neoplatonic hypostases. So the Quranic term "face of Allah" is it refers to the universal intellect. Allah does not have a literal face, and Allah does not have a metaphorical face, at least at the level of the divine essence. So the term "face of Allah" denotes a reality that functions analogically to a face. So what is a face? A face is the means by which you recognize someone, right? Or something. So that the Quranic word "face of Allah," wajhullah, it refers to the universal intellect. The universal intellect is the face of Allah. And wherever you turn, there is the face of Allah, because everything in the universe is a manifestation of the forms in the first intellect. So yeah, everywhere you turn is the face of Allah. Or everything will perish except His face. Well, this is telling you that the universal intellect is eternal. It's imperishable. It always exists, right? Whereas everything under the intellect is going in it's in a state between potentiality and actuality, but the universal intellect is actual. It's perfect. Allah's 2 hands, we would say the same thing. One hand is the intellect, and the other hand of Allah is the soul. So we have a very easy time dealing with that are anthropomorphic, right? We interpret them symbolically as referring to the Neoplatonic hypostases. So for us, it's a very easy thing. But if you're not a Neoplatonist, and if you're a Athari or a Sufi, you're gonna have problems with this. Again, not all Sunnis, just the Atharis or the Salafis. You may say that you don't know what the face of Allah is, That's one position. Or you may say that Allah does have a face, literally, but it's not like our face, but it's still a face. And he has two eyes, not like our eyes, but it's still two eyes. You end up in this very confusing form of incoherent talk that either appeals to negative Mysterianism or positive Mysterianism, and you run into a logical contradiction either way. And this is what I was pointing out in the debate that I had. And also another professor, Professor Bo Branson, did a streaming, because I said, look, man, like, what do you think as a philosopher? Do you like, I asked him about this, again, Salafi / Athari view of God's hands being real hands, yet not our hands, not like hands. And he agreed that this leads to contradiction. So that's the point that I was making. But for Islamic philosophers and mystics, these verses are not problematic at all. We may even go further. We would say, for example, that in some verses, the hand of Allah refers to the Prophet himself. There's a verse that says, when people came to Muhammad and they gave allegiance to him, Muhammad's hand would be over their hand. Like when you give allegiance to the Prophet, his hand is over your hand. But the Quran says Allah's hand is over their hand, right? So in that verse, it's clearly talking about the Prophet. The Prophet he's being called the hand of God because he represents on earth. So that's how we would deal with these sort of verses, and it's not a problem for our traditions.
The very last question that I think I'm going to ask is from Reginald O'Donoghue. So he asks, how exactly does saintly intercession presuppose Neoplatonism? I'll let you tackle that. I don't know if you said presuppose, but I know you said at least that saintly intercession and Neoplatonism, there's a connection.
Yeah. Presuppose would be a strong word. If I used it, I should qualify it. I would say that many Muslim practices of intercession and saint veneration. So what do I mean by that? So by intercession, I mean it's a very common practice for Muslims, Shia and Sunni, to this day to call out the name of the Prophet or the Prophet's family, the Imams for Shia, or just the saints. There are many Muslim figures regarded as saints like Jalaluddin Rumi or Abdul Qadir Jilani. It's very common for Muslims, either at a shrine or in their home, to call out to these people. So, for example, Ismailis, we every day, when I greet another Ismaili, we say, Ya Ali Madad. This is a calling out to Ali, the son of Prophet Muhammad. You're calling help. That's what Madad means. Sunnis will call upon saints like Abdul Qadir Jilani. They might even call upon a living Sufi saint, even though you're not physically with them. So this is a common practice. Now, this practice is an outward manifestation of a Neoplatonic worldview, and here's why. So the reason why we even bother calling out to a prophet or an imam or a saint, like why don't we just call on God directly, as a Protestant would say, or as a Salafi would say, right? Just say Ya Allah, or just pray directly to God. Why are you doing all this? So here's the thing. In classical theism, this goes beyond Neoplatonism, so Aquinas will say this too. In classical theism, God doesn't change. God's always giving you his blessings. So God eternally is already answering your prayers. You're not trying to change God when you call on God, right? You're not trying to get him to change his mind. God is timeless. So when we pray, what are we trying to do? We're actually trying to change ourselves. This is something that the Christian scholastic tradition and the Islamic Neoplatonic tradition, we all agree on this. When you pray, you're changing yourself. You're trying to become more receptive to what God eternally is already giving you. So we do that when we say as Christians, or Surah Fatiha as Muslims, the daily prayers that Muslims do, which are prayers to God. We are increasing our receptivity to God. God is already eternally giving his mercy and his light. Okay, so that's already happening. And to the effect that your prayer changes you, makes you more receptive, you will find the answers to your prayers. But if you can have someone who's spiritually higher than you pray for you, so if Prophet Muhammad prays for me, if Imam Ali prays for me, if a Sufi saint prays for me, their prayers are going to further open me up. They're going to make me even more receptive to God's things. Okay? So we have additional practices as Muslims where after we do our mandatory prayers, which are to God, in addition to that, we call out to elect the prophets, the saints. And when we call on Ali or Muhammad or a Sufi saint, we are asking them to pray for us. And what their prayer does, and the Quran actually substantiates this, the prayer of the prophet and his inheritors, their prayer affects a change in us. They make us even more receptive to God than we could on our own prayers alone. And this is all part of a Neoplatonic worldview, because in a Neoplatonic worldview, the emanation that starts from God through the intellect and the soul, it's just raining down all the time. And what we are supposed to do is we're trying to capture this emanation. So I can try to capture it by myself, or I can seek some of that emanation from a human soul like Prophet Muhammad or Imam Ali. They have captured the most amount that a human soul could capture, right? And I'm asking them to share some of the divine blessings they've received more of. I'm saying, okay, you can share it with us. And that's what they have the authority to do that. And when they pray for you, they're actually benefiting you. They're sharing, they're transmitting what God has given them eternally. They're transmitting some of it to us, to us out. So that makes intercession of saints or prophets or imams, that becomes an integral part of Islamic practice within the Neoplatonic world. The Sufis, whose worldview is fully Neoplatonic, the Sufis in the Sunni world are like the heaviest proponents of saint veneration. So it's not a coincidence that saint veneration comes from Islamic traditions that philosophically are Neoplatonic, because the intercession and the Neoplatonic emanation, it goes hand in hand. And there's a scholar by the name of Shahab Ahmed who, in his book, What is Islam, Chapter 1, he specifically made this observation that when Muslims go to shrines and they seek the blessings of a saint, dead or living, they are actually participating and affirming the Neoplatonic ontology and cosmology that's at the heart of Sufi mystical Islam.
Yeah, Khalil, thank you for that answer. Let me see if I can get you back online clearly. There we go. Okay, yeah. So I do want to make a few comments and then we can wrap up the show, right? But I think it was interesting because at least I know from the research that I'm doing now, like on the side, I'm looking into also the Jewish antecedents to, saint veneration. So I'm looking at a paper by William Horbury. And so it could be the case. I mean, I don't think what you're saying is that Neoplatonism leads to saint veneration, right? As if that was like the causal order where you need to first be a Neoplatonist and then you have, there are different ways that could come about, right? So, but you're saying that the metaphysics of Neoplatonism are conducive to having a system of veneration of saints. The other thing too is that so Khalil, I gotta say this because sometimes like people, they'll take snippets and clips of the video and they'll make comments about it. So, Khalil, people will say like, oh, well, Suan, look, like you have so much in common with Khalil on these matters of, veneration of saints and so on and so forth. And that shows that therefore Catholicism is wrong, as if somehow the more that we share in common, right, with Islam, that means that, Islam is like somehow the standard of wrongness or falsehood. And that's not fair at all, right? That's not how things work. It could be the case that we just so happen to be united on this particular truth and have this commonality with each other. And as you pointed out too, if the objector is Protestant, look at the Salafis, right, who reject the veneration, or I think you said they reject the veneration of saints, or you can find things that sound like sola scriptura in the Islamic tradition, right? So we shouldn't be using Islam as somehow the standard of wrongness for theology, right? That's not the right way to do things at all. And so I want to make that clear. Khalil, that's not how I view you. That's not how I view your particular faith.
The Muslim philosopher, one of the earliest Neoplatonists, Yaqub ibn Ishaq al-Kindi, he has a famous quote from him, and he says, and I quote, "We should not be ashamed to acknowledge truth and assimilate it from whatever source it comes to us, even if it is brought to us by former generations and foreign peoples. For him who seeks the truth, there is nothing of higher value than the truth itself. It never cheapens or debases him who reaches for it, but ennobles and awes." So this is from Al-Kindi. And this is the approach that I take, and I think it's the approach that you take, and many others.
Mm-hmm.
Truth is truth.
Right.
Truth comes from God, and there will be some truth everywhere. I don't think any tradition is going to be like 100% falsehood, right? There's going to be 1%, even 1% truth is going to be there. So we're looking for truth, and we can enjoy and appreciate truth when it comes from a religious or cultural tradition outside of ours. Like, why not? Because it's still the truth, you know. And as for sort of, Catholicism shares things with Islam, and so therefore they're both false or whatever. I mean, look, I can point you to an article by two Protestants where their anti-modal collapse argument was almost the same as mine. So now Protestants share something with us too, right? We should not forget, although I've used the term Protestant for some of the theologies I disagree with, but there's still a strong, it's not as loud as like in the Reformed tradition, even right now. So we could bring a Reformed, Protestant here, and they might agree with a lot of what we're saying too. At the end of the day, if you believe in one transcendent God who creates everything and sustains everything, we should not be surprised to find common truths among different religious traditions. It doesn't mean that now we think all religions are the same or any of that.
Mm-hmm.
Like that's not what we mean, right? I'm not a relativist. Okay,
Yep.
like that. I'm not a relativist. I'm not here to preach that we should combine everything in a one religion. No, I actually think in pluralism, we should affirm every religious tradition's uniqueness. Right? We should affirm that Catholics are not Protestants, Shias are not Sunnis, Shias are not Sunnis, and we're all unique, and we have real differences, and we can disagree, and it's okay to disagree as long as we treat each other well, right?
Yeah.
If we treat each other well, we can have as many debates as you want, and we'll disagree. We're Muslims. We don't think Jesus is God. We don't believe in the Trinity, and you guys know that, right?
Yeah.
So having known that, we can still have conversation about metaphysics and philosophy and ethics and all this stuff. We can do that, and it is worth noting that the Catholic Church, probably among all the Christian in the world, Catholic Church seems to have the warmest relationship with Muslims.
Mm-hmm.
So as a Catholic, you are encouraged by your popes and the different guidance from Vatican II. You're encouraged to have dialogue with people like me. And it's also worth noting, just on the Ismaili side, the residence of Imam of the Ismailis, His Highness the Aga Khan, is in Lisbon, Portugal. His is there. It's called the seat of the Ismaili Imamate. So there's a special Ismaili presence in Portugal. Portugal is a Catholic country, and the reason why we have this seat of the Ismaili Imamate in Portugal is decades-long warm relationship between the Ismaili Imamate and the Catholic Church, right? And that our religious leadership has worked together on some of these issues. So at the highest level, right, we have a warm relationship. In fact, there's a photo online of Pope Benedict meeting my Imam, the Aga Khan. It's like a rare photo of them like shaking hands and stuff. So, and just recently, Pope Francis met with the Ayatollah, the most popular leading Ayatollah of the 12er Shia, a different Shia group, Ayatollah Sistani. He met Pope Francis, and everybody was like, this is like a very important thing. So we should have more dialogues. We should be honest. We agree on this, and we disagree on the other thing. And as long as we're honest and ethical, I think this is totally fine. And people should feel good when they see these interactions. You know, nobody should sort of weaponize a interaction between Christians and Muslims. We need more understanding and more pluralism. We don't need more intolerance.
Hey, Khalil, I really appreciate you coming on to the show today. And even I had one person say, I really like Dr. Khalil. So that was great to hear. Well, Khalil, I think I'll wrap it up from here, but thank you once again for coming on.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. I look forward to more dialogues. Thank you for being flexible with the timing. But I look forward to more. I watch your channel, and I look forward to other guests. And I wish in your, you know, I was sort of your own, and you know, we're in touch about academics and stuff like that. So I wish you the best in your endeavors.
Oh, thank you so much.